My name is Alara, and for the longest time, my world felt like a meticulously arranged still life, beautiful to observe but fragile, tethered to the whims of its creator, my husband, Julian. We lived in a charming, historically preserved house in a suburb of Boston, a place Julian, a partner at Apex Developments, often referred to as our portfolio piece. My own aspirations, those of a botanical illustrator, had long since been pressed between the pages of old sketchbooks like forgotten flowers. Julian hadn't explicitly forbidden my art. He'd simply, with gentle persuasiveness, suggested my talents were better utilized curating our home, our social life, the backdrop for his ascent. "We don't need the income, darling," he'd say, "and I need you here," making all this a sweep of his hand encompassing our perfectly appointed life, run smoothly. And I, wanting peace, wanting his approval, had gradually, almost imperceptibly, agreed. Our 10th anniversary was meant to be a quiet celebration, a week in Provence, just the two of us. But Julian's oldest friends, Thomas and Mark, recently successful in a joint tech venture, decided to surprise us. The surprise, it turned out, was that our intimate getaway became an extension of their boisterous, wine-fueled victory lap. I found myself, once again, relegated to the role of gracious, smiling appendage. The evening it happened, we were in Soleil-sur-Rivière, a village that clung to the hillside like a cluster of sun-baked honeycombs. The air, thick with the scent of lavender and thyme from the nearby fields, should have been intoxicatingly romantic. Instead, it was charged with the undercurrent of an argument that had been brewing all day. Julian had been drinking steadily since their lavish lunch, his laughter too loud, his pronouncements increasingly grand. "Julian, perhaps another bottle isn't wise," I'd murmured, as Thomas signaled the waiter at a rustic bistro, its tables spilling onto a cobbled square. "Oh, let him live a little, Alara," Mark chimed in, a smirk playing on his lips. "Jules is celebrating. You should try it sometime." Julian, emboldened, had waved away my concern. "She worries too much, don't you, love?" He didn't wait for an answer. Later, as we walked back towards our rented jeet, the argument, simmering for hours, finally boiled over. It wasn't about the wine, not really. It was about years of feeling unheard, of my gentle suggestions being framed as criticisms, of my own quiet needs being overshadowed by his more flamboyant ones. "You always have to find something wrong, don't you?" Julian slurred, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow lane. "Can't you just enjoy things? Enjoy being an afterthought, Julian? Enjoy watching you become someone I barely recognize when you're with them." My voice trembled, a rarity for me. I usually swallowed my frustrations. We reached our rented Citroën, parked near the edge of the village. Thomas and Mark were already inside, windows down, some loud, thumping music spilling out. "I just think you could be more considerate," I said, my voice low, trying to pull the conversation back from the brink. Julian scoffed. "Considerate? I bring you to Provence. I provide everything, and you lecture me about consideration." He turned to the car. "Get in, Alara. I'm not standing here listening to this. I'm not getting in until we can talk about this properly when you're sober." A flicker of something cold and hard passed through Julian's eyes. He exchanged a look with Thomas in the driver's seat. "You know what?" Julian said, his voice suddenly light, dangerously so. "You're so independent, Alara. So capable. Let's see how you manage this." He leaned towards Thomas. "Let's go, Tom. Let's see how she gets back." Laughter, sharp and cruel, erupted from the car. Thomas revved the engine. "Julian, don't you dare." I cried, a knot of disbelief tightening in my chest. But the car was already moving. Julian, in the passenger seat, looked back, a strange, unreadable expression on his face, before turning away. The red taillights receded, painting fleeting streaks on the ancient stone walls, then vanished around a bend. The thumping music faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of the bistro. I stood frozen, the scent of lavender suddenly cloying, suffocating. "He'll come back," I whispered to the empty lane, the words tasting like ash. This is just one of his dramatic gestures to teach me a lesson. But the lesson, as the minutes stretched into an agonizing hour, felt far more sinister. The village, so charming in the golden afternoon light, now seemed to press in on me, its shuttered windows like judging eyes. The sky bled from dusky rose to a deep, indifferent indigo. My handbag, a small, impractical clutch Julian had insisted matched my dress, contained my phone, a lipstick, and a thin silk scarf. My wallet, with all my cash and credit cards, was in Julian's jacket pocket. "Safer there, darling," he'd said earlier. "Your little bag is overflowing." A common occurrence. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle through the numbness. I tried calling Julian. Straight to voicemail. Thomas. Voicemail. Mark. Voicemail. A horrifying realization dawned. This wasn't an impulsive act. This was coordinated. A text message to Julian, "Where are you? This isn't funny." Delivered. Unread. Blocked. I realized it when I tried again, the calls no longer even ringing. They'd all blocked me. The €50 note tucked into a tiny zippered compartment of my clutch felt pathetically inadequate. It was all I had. I found a small, family-run auberge just off the main square. The proprietor, a stout woman with kind, weary eyes, spoke no English, but she understood the universal language of distress. She showed me to a tiny room under the eaves, with a sloping ceiling and a narrow bed. The scent of old wood and dried herbs was strangely comforting. Sleep was a battlefield, lost to replays of Julian's face, the laughter, the receding taillights. Each creak of the floorboards outside my door sent a surge of desperate hope, quickly extinguished. By morning, a fragile resolution had formed. I would wait. He would realize the enormity of his actions, the cruelty, and he would return, sheepish, perhaps, but he would return. Our life, our carefully constructed image, depended on it. But he didn't come. The second day, the €50 dwindled. A piece of bread, a bottle of water. I walked the perimeter of Soleil-sur-Rivière, then ventured to the dusty main road, scanning for any sign of their car. Nothing. The proprietor, Madame Dubois, would find me sitting on the worn bench in her small lobby, my gaze fixed on the street. She'd offer me a sympathetic smile and a small glass of lemonade, her kindness a stark contrast to the casual brutality I'd experienced. On the third day, the reality was undeniable. They were gone. They had moved on, likely to the next picturesque town on their itinerary, leaving me behind like a forgotten souvenir. The shame was a physical ache, a constant companion to the gnawing fear. How could he? How could the man who vowed to cherish me, who knew my quiet nature, my aversion to chaos, subject me to this? That afternoon, standing before the chipped glass window of a tiny, cluttered shop that seemed to sell everything from postcards to old jewelry, I made a decision that felt like severing a limb. My grandmother's locket. It was delicate, 18-karat gold, intricately chased with forget-me-nots, a gift for my 16th birthday. Inside, faded sepia portraits of my parents, lost to me in my early 20s. It was my most treasured possession, a tangible link to unconditional love. The shopkeeper, a wizened man with eyes that seemed to have seen all of life's sorrows, examined it with a loupe. He offered me a sum that was a fraction of its sentimental, let alone material, worth. But it was enough. Enough for a bus ticket, enough for a meal, enough for a chance. "France is beautiful, non," he said, counting out the worn euro notes. "You travel far?" I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Family, friends. Julian had always been the sun around which my small constellation of relationships orbited. My parents were gone. My few close friends from a life before Julian had drifted, gently discouraged by his subtle possessiveness, his preference for couples who mirrored our aspirations. Calling them now would mean unraveling a carefully woven tapestry of competence and contentment, exposing the raw, frayed threads beneath. It would mean admitting the grand failure of the life I'd presented to the world and to myself. The bus station in the nearby larger town of Apt was a cacophony of diesel fumes and hurried announcements. A departure board listed destinations: Marseille, Lyon, Nice, and further, connections to Italy, Spain. My finger hovered over the contact for Julian's sister, Clara. She was kind. Perhaps she would understand. Wire money for a flight back to Boston. Back to what? To explanations, to the inevitable blame I would somehow shoulder for provoking him, to the suffocating weight of his forgiveness, which would indebt me further. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. A few years ago, I'd tentatively mentioned wanting to take a course to refresh my botanical illustration skills, perhaps even exhibit. Julian had smiled, that charming, slightly patronizing smile. But why, Alara? Your garden is your canvas now. And you manage everything so beautifully here. Don't complicate things, darling. He'd squeezed my hand, kissed my forehead, and the conversation, like my nascent ambition, had withered. Madam? Where to? The ticket agent, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, was looking at me expectantly. The word formed on my lips before I consciously chose it, a whisper of defiance, a leap into the unknown. Greece, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. The furthest, quietest island village you can get me a ticket to. The journey was a blur of cramped seats, stale air, and the kindness of strangers who shared food or offered directions in broken English. From Apt to Marseille, then a ferry to Athens, another, smaller ferry to a rocky, sun-drenched island whose name, Petalida, sounded like a promise of unfolding beauty. Finally, a rattling local bus deposited me, stiff and grimy, in a tiny fishing village called Pyrgos to Ilia, Tower of the Sun. The air smelled of salt, wild oregano, and the subtle perfume of unseen citrus blossoms. My phone had died somewhere in the Aegean Sea. The remaining euros from the sale of my locket felt thin and insufficient in my pocket. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak, blurring the edges of the whitewashed houses tumbling down to a turquoise bay. I had been abandoned, stripped of my familiar comforts, my identity as Julian's wife. Yet, as I stood on the small stone jetty, watching the fishing boats bobbing like colorful toys, a strange, unexpected feeling unfurled within me. It wasn't joy, not yet, but a fragile sort of lightness, a terrifying, exhilarating sense of being untethered. Julian had meant to break my spirit, to remind me of my dependence. He couldn't have known that in his cruelty, he had inadvertently handed me a compass pointing not back to him, but towards a self I had long ago misplaced. The Greek sun, even in late afternoon, was a warm hand on my face. I walked, aimlessly at first, away from the small cluster of houses that constituted Pyrgos to Ilia, my impractical sandals, bought for elegant strolls in Provence, chafing against my dusty feet. The path led upwards, away from the sea, into a landscape of silver-green olive trees and sun-baked earth. My water bottle was long empty. Thirst was a raw scrape in my throat, hunger a hollow ache. The world began to tilt, the olive trees shimmering, their leaves like 1,000 tiny mirrors reflecting the dazzling sky. This is it, then, I thought, a strange detachment settling over me. Left by my husband in France, to collapse alone on a Greek hillside. There was a certain bleak poetry to it. My knees buckled. The rough, stony ground rushed up to meet me. Darkness, cool and welcoming, bloomed at the edges of my vision. Pi Alpha. Kappa Omicron Pi Lambda Alpha Mu Omicron Upsilon. Opa. My girl. The voice was feminine, resonant, cutting through the haze. Weathered hands, surprisingly strong, turned me onto my back. A face swam into focus above me, elderly, framed by a dark headscarf, her skin a roadmap of sun-etched lines, her eyes, the color of dark honey, wide with concern. She spoke rapidly in Greek, patting my cheeks, then produced a battered metal canteen, holding it to my lips. Cool water, tasting faintly of metal and herbs, trickled down my throat, an elixir. Enough strength returned for me to sit up, though my head spun. She pointed to herself. Theodora. Her smile was warm, crinkling the corners of her eyes. I touched my chest. Alara, I managed, my voice a croak. Theodora nodded, then, with a grunt of effort, helped me to my feet. Her small frame was wiry and powerful. She gestured up the path, towards a stone farmhouse nestled among the olive trees, its whitewashed walls glowing softly in the fading light. She made walking motions with her fingers, her expression gentle but firm. I was too weak, too utterly spent, to do anything but nod and allow her to guide me. The kitchen of the farmhouse was a haven. Cool, dim, it smelled of drying herbs hanging from rough-hewn beams, of wood smoke, and something savory simmering on an ancient, cast-iron stove. Theodora settled me onto a sturdy wooden chair at a well-scrubbed pine table. She called out, "Spiro. Lambda Alpha. Spiro. Come." A man appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a faded cotton cloth. He was as weathered as Theodora, with a thick silver mustache, his dark eyes assessing me with a cautious curiosity that wasn't unkind. "Spiros," Theodora said, gesturing to him. He was her husband. He gave me a reserved nod. Theodora pressed a glass of cool water into my hands, then ladled a fragrant, brothy soup into a rustic earthenware bowl, placing it before me with a chunk of dark, crusty bread. My stomach rumbled audibly. A small smile touched Theodora's lips. That first evening was a patchwork of gestures, single words, and the universal language of kindness. I tried, haltingly, to explain my presence, but the story of Julian, of Provence, of the abandonment, felt too complex, too shameful to convey with my non-existent Greek and their few words of English. Tears eventually came, a quiet, exhausted weeping. Theodora simply patted my hand, murmuring soothing Greek phrases, while Spiros watched, his expression softening from caution to a kind of grave understanding. They offered me a small, whitewashed room off the main living area. It held a narrow bed with a hand-stitched quilt, a small wooden chair, and a single window looking out onto the olive grove, its leaves whispering in the night breeze. I fell into a sleep so profound it was like sinking into deep water. Morning arrived with the crowing of a distant rooster and the aroma of coffee and baking bread. At the foot of my bed, I found a neatly folded cotton dress, faded but clean, and a soft, knitted cardigan. They were simple, practical, and when I slipped them on, they felt like a costume for a new, unfamiliar role. In the kitchen, Theodora beamed at my appearance, immediately pouring me a small cup of strong, sweet Greek coffee and offering fresh bread, still warm, with a dish of their own green gold olive oil and a dollop of local honey. With the clarity of daylight, embarrassment washed over me. These strangers had taken me in, fed me, clothed me. I had to explain, to offer what little money I had left, to find my own way. Using a translation app on my phone, which Spiros had managed to charge with a collection of ancient-looking adapters, I pieced together my gratitude and my intention to leave, to find lodging in the village. Theodora's face fell. She shook her head vehemently, pointing outside where a soft rain had begun to fall, then to my still tender feet, which she gently tended the night before with a pungent herbal salve. Kyoto, no, she insisted. Stay. Rest. Stay and rest were among the few English words she knew, and she uttered them with an undeniable authority. Over the next few days, I made several tentative efforts to depart. Each time, I was met with Theodora's gentle but unyielding resistance. Once, with my small bag packed and my battered sandals on, she met me at the door, her expression so genuinely wounded that a wave of guilt, sharp and unexpected, washed over me. She took my hand, her own calloused but warm, and led me to a small, carved wooden box on a shelf. Opening it, she revealed a collection of old photographs. Her fingers, gnarled with age and work, trembled slightly as she pointed to a black-and-white photo of a young woman with Theodora's luminous eyes and Spiros's strong jawline. "Sophia," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Then she pointed towards the window, to the distant horizon. "Australia." Her eyes welled. She made a cradling motion with her arms, then held her hand at waist height. "Epsilon Gamma Gamma Omicron Kappa Iota." Grandchild. She found another photo, more recent, of a cherubic baby. "No see." A pang of understanding shot through me. Sophia, their daughter, was far away, perhaps unable to visit often. In me, a solitary, adrift woman, Theodora saw not a burden, but perhaps a fleeting echo of her absent child, a temporary solace for an aching space in her heart. My own loneliness resonated with hers. I nodded slowly, a silent agreement passing between us, and unslung my bag. Life on their small farm settled into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the seasons, a rhythm I slowly began to learn. Theodora showed me how to gather warm eggs from the nesting boxes in the small chicken coop, her movements economical and gentle. She taught me to hang laundry on the line stretched between two ancient olive trees, positioning it just so, to catch the sea breeze. Spiros, a man of few words but infinite patience, took me into the sprawling olive grove that was their lifeblood. He showed me how to identify the different varieties of olives, how to spot the telltale signs of the destructive olive fly, how to prune the silvery branches for optimal growth. He taught me to tend their small, terraced vegetable garden, distinguishing weeds from precious herbs with a knowing touch. The work was physical, grounding. My hands, accustomed to the delicate tasks of illustration and the light touch of a keyboard, quickly blistered, then calloused. Muscles I hadn't known existed ached each evening. But with each sunrise, I felt a little stronger, a little more capable. More importantly, the frantic loop of Julian's betrayal, the shame, the anger, began to quiet in my mind, replaced by the immediate concerns of the day: shelling beans for dinner, learning the Greek word for water, or thank you. Trying to bake bread with Theodora in her outdoor stone oven, my first attempts were comically disastrous, emerging either pale and doughy or blackened like charcoal. Theodora would just laugh, a warm, rumbling sound, break off a piece, taste it critically, and say, "Alpha Iota Omicron Kappa Alpha Lambda Tau Epsilon Rho Alpha. Tomorrow, better." Her acceptance of imperfection was a revelation. In Julian's world, mistakes were failures to be concealed. Here, they were simply part of learning. Evenings were quiet. We'd sit on the small stone terrace as the sun dipped into the Aegean, painting the sky in hues of apricot and violet. Theodora would knit, her needles clicking a soft, companionable rhythm, while Spiro smoked his pipe, the scent of his tobacco mingling with the jasmine climbing the trellis. I found myself sketching again, not the precise botanical studies of my past, but quick, impressionistic drawings of the gnarled olive trees, the curve of the bay, Theodora's expressive hands. A profound sense of peace, fragile yet tenacious, began to settle in my soul. The betrayal was still a scar, but here, surrounded by the ancient land and the quiet dignity of these two people, it no longer felt like the defining event of my life. It was becoming a catalyst, a painful but necessary unmooring. Weeks turned into a month, then two. My Greek improved, slowly, from single words to halting phrases. I learned to make spanakopita, its flaky pastry a mystery I was determined to master. I learned the satisfaction of harvesting sun-warmed tomatoes, their scent rich and earthy. I learned that my body, which I had often viewed critically through the lens of Julian's subtle expectations, was strong and capable, responding to honest labor with a resilience I hadn't known it possessed. The expensive creams and carefully curated wardrobe of my Boston life seemed like artifacts from a distant, almost alien existence. Here, dressed in Sophia's old, softened cotton clothes, my skin tanned by the sun, my hair often braided simply to keep it out of my eyes, I felt more myself than I had in years. One afternoon, as Theodora and I were sorting olives harvested from a small, early ripening section of the grove, she looked at me, her gaze thoughtful. "Alara," she began, her English, like my Greek, slowly expanding. "Home. America, you won't go." She made a gesture of a plane flying. The question, so direct, landed with surprising force. Home. The word conjured the cool, elegant interiors of our Boston house, the hushed dinner parties, Julian's controlling hand on the reins of our life, so subtle I'd barely registered it as control, merely as efficient management. I saw his easy dismissal of my art, his casual redirection of my ambitions towards his own. Tears pricked my eyes, not of self-pity, but of a dawning, painful clarity. Words tumbled out, a mix of English and newly learned Greek, a torrent of emotion that transcended language. I spoke of Julian's casual cruelty, of years spent shrinking myself to fit the space he allotted me, of the suffocating weight of a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow within. Theodora listened, her head tilted, her dark eyes filled with a profound, compassionate understanding. When I finally fell silent, voice hoarse, she reached out and covered my hand with her own. She then pointed to her heart, then to the olive trees, the stone house, the shimmering sea, and finally, to me. Her meaning was unmistakable. "This is a home too. You have a place here." I work, I managed, mimicking Spiros's movements as he tended the trees. "I stay. I work for you. For my keep." Theodora's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Nu Alphiota," she said, squeezing my hand. "Yes." "Good." She turned back to the olives, as if we had just settled something as simple as the next day's chores, rather than the trajectory of my life. But in that moment, something shifted within me. I wasn't just a visitor, a recipient of charity. I was choosing to be here. I was choosing this new, uncertain path. The next morning, Spiros woke me before dawn. "Lambda Alpha, Alara," he said, handing me a pair of sturdy work boots, Sophia's, again, and a wide-brimmed straw hat. My real apprenticeship had begun. The olive harvest was in full swing, and I was no longer an observer, but a participant. Spiros taught me to lay the large nets beneath the trees, to use the long, slender poles called catsounds to gently dislodge the olives, to comb the branches with wooden rakes. It was arduous, repetitive work, my shoulders burning, my hands raw despite the salve Theodora applied each night. But there was a deep satisfaction in it, a connection to the earth, to the generations who had worked this same land. I learned to distinguish the nuances of the oil, the peppery bite of the early harvest, the buttery smoothness of the later pressings. Theodora initiated me into the mysteries of her kitchen on a deeper level, not just cooking for sustenance, but preserving the bounty of their land, jarring olives, sun-drying tomatoes, making fig jam. My botanical illustration skills, dormant for so long, found a new outlet. I began sketching the wild herbs Theodora gathered, the intricate patterns on a butterfly's wing, the changing light on the mountains across the bay. I created small, hand-painted labels for their olive oil bottles, depicting the silvery leaves and dark fruit, a small contribution that brought a pleased smile to Spiros's face and a proud nod from Theodora. "Pi Omicron Lambda Mu Omicron Rho Phi Alpha, very beautiful," she'd say. "Your hands remember." They began to introduce me to others in Pyrgos to Ilia. At the weekly market in the small placia, where they sold their oil and a few vegetables, I was Eta Epsilon Lambda O Alpha Mu Alpha R Alara. Katerina, the baker's wife, a woman with a booming laugh and an expansive heart, invited me for coffee with the other village women. Their rapid-fire Greek was mostly incomprehensible at first, but their warmth was universal. Slowly, I began to piece together conversations, to share smiles, to feel the tentative threads of community weaving around me. One evening, nearly 4 months after my arrival, as we sat on the terrace, Spiros cleared his throat. "Alara," he said, his English more deliberate than usual. "Theodora and me, We are old. This land, these trees, they need young hands, young heart. Theodora reached for my hand. Sophia, she not come back to live. Her life is Australia. This farm, it is too much for two old people. She paused, her gaze steady on mine. We think, maybe, you want be partner? With us? One day, maybe, all yours. The generosity of their offer, the trust it implied, left me speechless. Tears welled, but this time, they were tears of overwhelming gratitude. They saw me not as the abandoned wife, the pitiful foreigner, but as someone capable, someone worthy of this legacy. I don't know what to say, I stammered. Yes, of course, yes. The decision solidified something within me. This wasn't just a refuge anymore, it was a commitment. I threw myself into learning every aspect of the farm, from the soil composition to the Byzantine bureaucracy of agricultural subsidies. I started a proper ledger for their accounts, using my old organizational skills to bring a gentle order to their charmingly chaotic paperwork. With their blessing, I even created a simple website with photos of the farm and their oil, translating the text into English and German for the tourists who occasionally found their way to Pyrgos to Ilia. One afternoon, sorting through a small box of belongings I'd acquired, a few books, my sketch pads, some sea glass, I found the dead mobile phone. Curiosity, a faint tug from a world I'd almost forgotten, prompted me to ask Spiros if he could charge it again. He fiddled with his collection of wires and plugs, and eventually, the screen flickered to life. There were no messages from Julian. No missed calls beyond those first frantic days in Provence. It was as if I had simply evaporated from his life. A strange sort of peace settled over me. He hadn't searched, hadn't cared enough to. The final thread, the one of lingering, foolish hope, finally snapped. I did, however, find an old, unread email from my former mentor in Boston, sent months ago, shortly after I'd left. She'd heard of a small, ethical company looking for a freelance botanical illustrator for a series of educational pamphlets on Mediterranean flora. It made me think of you, Alara. Perhaps you're looking for a new project. A new project? The thought sent a small thrill through me. Here on Petalida, surrounded by the very flora they needed illustrating. It was a few weeks later, on a bright, crisp morning in early November, that a sleek, unfamiliar rental car, dust billowing behind it, pulled up the track to the farmhouse. I was mending a section of olive netting near the drying racks, Theodora inside kneading bread, Spiros out in the groves. My heart gave a sudden, hard thump against my ribs, a premonition. A man emerged from the car, tall, impeccably dressed in a way that screamed city, out of place amidst the rustic simplicity. He took off his expensive sunglasses, scanning the farmhouse with an air of impatient assessment. Julian. He hadn't seen me yet. I had a moment to observe him, this ghost from a past life. He looked thinner, a little strained around the eyes, but otherwise unchanged. The same carefully styled hair, the same air of entitled confidence. But somehow he seemed diminished against the vast backdrop of the mountains and the ancient olive trees. Alara, he called out, his voice tentative, as if unsure this humble setting could possibly contain the wife he knew. I put down the netting, wiped my hands on my worn apron, and slowly walked towards him. My pulse was a wild bird in my chest, but my steps felt steady on the familiar earth. Julian, I said. My voice was calm, a stranger to the woman who had wept in a tiny room in Provence. His eyes widened, first in recognition, then in disbelief, sweeping over my simple dress, my sun-browned skin, my work-roughened hands. Alara? My God, what happened to you? What is this place? This is my home, Julian, I said quietly. Theodora had appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable, a silent sentinel. Your home. He laughed, a short, incredulous sound. Don't be ridiculous. I've been looking for you for months. Private investigators, the works. Your friends, my family, everyone's been worried sick. This This escapade has gone on long enough. I'm here to take you back. He stepped forward, reaching for my arm. I instinctively stepped back, out of his reach. Take me back? To what, Julian? To our life, of course. To Boston. To civilization. He gestured dismissively at the farmhouse, the olive groves. What have you been doing here? Playing peasant. The sting of his condescension was familiar, but it no longer had the power to wound me. I've been learning, Julian. I've been working. I've been finding a part of myself I lost a long time ago, or perhaps never knew I had. Lost? He looked genuinely bewildered. Alara, you had everything. I had your life, Julian. Not mine. I saw Theodora take a small step forward, her eyes fixed on him. Spiros was now approaching from the groves, his expression stern. Look, Julian said, his tone softening slightly, an attempt at his old charm. I know I messed up in Provence. It was stupid, a drunken prank with the guys. I am sorry. Truly. I never thought, well, I thought you'd call, get a cab, meet us in the next town. I was angry, I overreacted. But this, he shook his head. This is an overreaction on your part, darling. It wasn't a prank, Julian, I said, my voice even. It was cruel. And it was clarifying. Spiros reached my side, placing a hand on my shoulder. He said something in Greek to Julian, his voice low but firm. What did he say? Julian asked, frowning. He asked what you want here, I translated. I want my wife back. Julian exclaimed, his frustration mounting. Alara, be reasonable. Our house, our friends, your responsibilities. I have responsibilities here, I said, gesturing to Theodora and Spiros, to the land around us. These people took me in when I had nothing, when my own husband had abandoned me. They've given me kindness, a purpose. They've offered me a share in this farm in their life. Julian stared at me, then at Theodora and Spiros, as if seeing them for the first time not as background figures, but as actual people with a claim on me. You can't be serious. You'd choose this hardship over everything we had. What you call hardship, Julian, I'm starting to see as authenticity, as connection, as peace. I took a breath. My mentor emailed. There's a company that wants me to do botanical illustrations for them. Here. From Petalida. I'm going to do it. His face, for the first time, registered a flicker of something that might have been actual surprise, perhaps even a sliver of respect, quickly masked. Illustrations? Alara, we don't need the money. It was never about the money, Julian. You know that. It was about having something that was mine. I met his gaze, holding it. I'm not coming back with you. The words hung in the clear, bright air between us. Julian looked from me to Theodora, then to Spiros, a dawning understanding, or perhaps resignation, slowly etching itself onto his features. The fight seemed to drain out of him. So this is it, he said, his voice flat. You're just staying here? Yes, I said. This is where I belong now. He stood there for a long moment, the expensive cut of his clothes looking alien against the backdrop of the ancient stone and silvery olive leaves. He finally nodded, a curt, almost defeated gesture. All right, Alara. If this is what you truly want. He turned, walked back to his rental car without another word, the confident stride slightly less sure now. He didn't look back as he drove away, the dust rising once more, then settling. When the sound of his car had faded, Theodora came and put her arm around my shoulders. Spiros patted my other arm. No words were needed. We stood there for a moment, the three of us, gazing out at the olive groves, the sun warm on our faces. The air smelled of thyme and wood smoke and the promise of the coming olive pressing. Later that day, I sat on the terrace with my sketchbook, a delicate cyclamen I'd found blooming amongst the rocks as my subject. The lines flowed from my pencil with a new confidence. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet strength, a sense of rightness. I didn't know what the future held, not entirely. But I knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in my bones that I was finally on my own path under my own sun. Julian had tried to teach me a lesson about dependence. Instead, he had gifted me the unexpected, terrifying, beautiful lesson of my own resilience. He had thought to see how I would get back, never imagining I wouldn't want to return to where he was, but would instead find my way forward to myself. And for that, in a strange, complicated way, I was almost grateful.